Hello, and welcome to the CMMC Churns. I'm Matt Titcomb, the CEO of Peak InfoSec, an authorized C3PO and CMMC Provisional Assessor. Today's episode is Scope Confusion, Part 2. Last week we discussed the Scope of Applicability from NIST 800-171, and this week we're going to carry on and discuss the CMMC Assessment Scope. For many of y'all, this is a lot more important topic that really needs a lot more time to be discussed because people are getting confused and they're also putting themselves at jeopardy. Because in reality, there is not a conflict between these two scopes. The simple reality is it's an and. They both exist together, and technically one exists within the other. And we're going to walk through that today. So in our last session, we discussed the CMMC, and the NIST 800-171 scope and how it came from NIST 800-171 paragraph 1.1. Well, how does this really fit? And how does the CMMC assessment scope fit within this? Well, so in reality, the CMMC assessment scope and all of this confusion is coming from DoD not being pithy. So the very first paragraph of the CMMC Assessment Scope Guide is identifying the CMMC Assessment Scope. They didn't say purpose. They didn't say this is the intent. No, this is an introductory paragraph. Come on, guys. Seriously? Let's get clear here. So the first thing we're going to do is let's strip out the junk language that's in this paragraph. So all of a sudden, when you take out those words right there, what you're left with is this document provides information on the specification of assessment scope for a CMMC assessment. Nowhere in that statement is anywhere you're being told what to apply controls to. This is all about the assessment scope. That is it. It's about what I am allowed to go assess, not about what you are supposed to go implement. That's two different topics. And everybody's getting this conversation with the assessment scope mixed up with the scope of applicability. The reality is the CMMC Assessment Scope Guide simply establishes the requirements for CMMC assessments. That's all. Now, let's put a nail in it. The CMMC Assessment Scope Guide does not authorize you all as an OSC to deviate from implementing the requirements in accordance with 800-171. Just because it's a CRMA and specialized asset is not an excuse. Well, let's then take that next step. Let's introduce you guys to the most recent hammer that DoD just published in a memorandum to all of its acquisition professionals and executives, program offices, etc. Now, the first paragraph you see up there is the title of the paragraph. So if you want to go find this in a PDF file, go for it. It's out there. I've posted it up on LinkedIn, and you should have this, and you should be ready for this. Now, the hammer really is you must implement all 800-171 requirements and have a plan of action per 800-171. If you don't, well, they may withhold progress payments, failed, not execute other contract options, and potentially terminate the contract in part or whole. Now, let's talk about this. If you're the prime, you get withheld. If you're the sub and you've caused this, the prime gets its payment withheld. And suddenly your relationship with your prime contractor has just gone down the drain. So again, you're required to implement all of 800-171 for all of your covered contractor information system. All of it. Now, how does this fit within the scope diagram that we talked about previously? First, security protection components. There's really no change. They changed the word from protection components to protection assets. So, no change there. CUI components are still there. Now what they've done is they've broken these into three distinct subcategories. The first one are CUI assets. things that, process, store, transmit CUI. The others are the Contractor Risk Managed assets. These that can but aren't intended to. Classic example I typically use, you're big, engineering firm and you've got a receptionist at your front lobby for visitors coming and going, and that's all that person does and manage, kind of the HR visitor management function. There's no intention for that receptionist to ever have access to CUI. Okay, that makes sense to put that in scope of a CRMA. Printers, those type of things. Yes, we're going to manage them, we're going to protect them, but they're kind of ancillary to what we really do. Doesn't mean you can ignore them again. Now, the other category are specialized assets. These are IoT machines, things that, basically milling machines, anything you're using to actually generate unique things needed to meet DoD's requirements. Now, here's the stupidity of this statement here. Sorry if DoD's watching this, but it really is annoying. If an asset is not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI, friggin' take it out of there and put it down into external and out of scope. It's easy to do. Don't create confusion. Don't create opportunities. Just take it out of scope. And if it's not intended, don't have it in scope. Did I say that enough yet? So I'll leave it at that. Now, when we look at this, kind of pulling back out, let's just re-emphasize this. This is your scope of applicability for where you need to apply 800-171 requirements. Your CMMC primary assessment scope are your CUI assets and your security protection components, also known as security protection assets. Secondary scope is going to be your contractor risk managed assets, subject to spot checking, i.e., let's make sure that secretary or that receptionist really doesn't have access or has not received CUI. We'll spot check those, so you're not going to get away from that. Now, specialized assets, we're only going to be reviewing that in your system security plan to make sure you've applied controls appropriately. Now, here's the twist. Most people do not realize just because you've moved something out of scope does not mean it's not subject to evaluation. You're actually subject to negative testing. Classic example is your guest wireless. It is my job to make sure that, yes, you have put logical isolation controls in. As we go through the other ones, I will be doing some level of negative testing to make sure your out-of-scope assets really are out of scope. Now, that's going to be very light, and it's going to be kind of along the side. But if I do know something that isn't working right, you've got another issue there, and we'll deal with that as a POAM item, hopefully, that DoD will allow us. Now, this entire diagram, this clarity that we're walking through today's slide, Mr. McEwen, Ms. Bosjanek, I hope you're watching this. I really hope that you guys understand the confusion that your sentences and the lack of clarity in the CMMC Assessment Guide have created. Please use something like this video, hand it off to your staff, call me, I'm more than willing to talk to them, but help us to clarify the CMMC Assessment Guide, because otherwise people are going to get themselves into trouble with the way this is written today. Now, when it comes to the actual process, how you use these two different sets of scopes, first and foremost, in that self-assessment phase, you need to apply all of the requirements in accordance with that scope of applicability. That's how you assess. Where is the CUI? What is storing, processing, transmitting it, or protecting it? It doesn't matter whether it's an asset, a person, or a technology, or a facility. Wherever that information goes, that's your scope. Whatever's protecting that information, that's your scope. Now, what comes next is then remediation. Again, apply all 800-171 controls to everything that is in scope per 800-171 paragraph 1.1. I warned you about y'all that I would be pounding that paragraph home. So if you don't remember that paragraph by the end of these 2 videos, I failed in my duty. The last part is in the actual assessment that as an assessor, when I come in, this is where you're going to be assessed against would be that CMMC assessment scope. What is the primary scope? Your CRMAs, for me reviewing them on a spot checking basis, and then ensuring that you've adequately covered and addressed and described security protection assets within your SSP. And the only reason they're in your SSP is, again, they're in scope. Lastly, let's sum up. 800-171 paragraph 1.1 defines your scope of applicability. The scope includes your people, facilities, and technologies. The CMMC assessment scope sits within your scope of applicability per the other diagram. Now, the guide is just that. It's a guide to scoping the CMMC conformity assessment. It's what we will use in combination with your POC when we're working to figure out your assessment scope and figure out, and this will also help us to drive costs, complexity, and time to complete your assessment. Lastly, well, second to last, the assessment scope does not allow you to ignore NIST 800-171 scopes. If you do, you're subject to a False Claims Act and other negative consequences for failing to provide adequate security. Let me reemphasize that. You are responsible to implement 800-171 for all components and scope, and if you choose not to do so because you choose to interpret the CMMC Assessment Guide as anything other for conducting the CMMC assessment, you are in violation of your requirements. So please don't do that. Again, I'm Matt Titcomb from Peak InfoSec. Thanks for joining us for this week's is the CMMC Churns, and hopefully this has really helped you to clarify CMMC scoping versus your scope of applicability. One last time, NIST 800-171, paragraph 1.1. Thanks.